bursting at the seams, which is great. A lot of talk, which when I'm going into the classroom, I'm always thrilled when I walk into a classroom and people are talking to each other. Already, I know half my battle is won. So, Tom, I'm happy to pass over the podium to you, to an excited group. So, we're lucky to have with us Tom Hawkins from The Ohio State University. He's another one of our finalists for the Presidential Hiring Initiative for an assistant professor in classical rhetoric and the rhetoric of engaged citizenry, or citizenship, or something like that. Anyway, we'll have the talk, we'll have a Q&A period, and then afterwards we invite everybody to stay and enjoy some refreshments out in the hall and to have a chance to talk to Tom some more. So Tom, the podium is yours.
Thank you very much. There is a handout up here. Has everybody gotten one? Can we send it around? All right, it's making its way around now. Thanks very much, especially to Dr. Condit and Dr. Biesecker, Dr. Norman, everybody who's made this trip smooth and easy sailing for me. Thank you for everybody who's come to events thus far and given your time. I know it's a lot of work to go through this on your end of things, and I very much appreciate it. I'm also very happy to be here in Athens. We have a long-standing history of UGA and OSU, a pipeline, as Nick Mantia knows, in the classics department. I'm happy to report Luke Thornton's off to New Mexico with a PhD. Kat Van Annen is just about dissertating, and Kelly Dugan is preparing for candidacy exams. I got an email from her actually as I was en route here yesterday about, can you fill in for this topic for me and these sorts of things. So it's a great pleasure to visit Athens. Having just finished a book on invective literary rhetoric, I'd like to talk today about what I call ancient Semitic rhetoric of ugly and disgusting bodies. Which is the topic of my current book project, and presents what I see as a break from traditional ways of studying classical rhetoric. Yes. Before I was a classicist, I was an environmental engineer, which you ferreted out, with a degree from Stanford, which at the time had the best environmental engineering program in the country. Now, very long removed from my engineering days, I find myself returning to environmental science in some ways in my approach to classics, because by all accounts, we're entering a new stage in human history. NASA, the UN, the IPCC, that's the International Panel on Climate Change, the Pentagon, Jared Diamond, Ian Morris, James Lovelock, and a host of others, all agree with the general assessment of Jeffrey Sachs, the Columbia University economist and head of the Earth Institute, that, to quote Sachs, the energy-climate nexus presents the most complicated public policy problem that the world at a global scale has ever had to face. We have to address the problem in the next 30 years, or the impact on the planet will be catastrophic. We've passed the point of safety, and every step that we take in the current direction is a reckless gamble with the future. Let me restate Sachs's plea for change with a rhetorical analogy. According to an old riddle, a pond contains a single lily pad. Each day the number of lily pads doubles, to the second day, for the third, 8th, 4th, etc. And the pond is covered by the 30th day. When is the pond half full? The answer to this simple riddle provides the title and starting point for MacArthur Fellow Lester Brown in his book, The 29th Day, in which he expresses his fear that our global pond, which soon will contain about 7 billion of us lily pads, may already be half full. Plato once said that the Greeks lived around the Mediterranean like so many frogs around a pond. But today we know that humanity is united around a much bigger pond. And so my approach to classical rhetoric tries to speak to the challenges of this new era by confronting ugliness and disgust. Because by the end of the archaic Greek era, ugly bodies served as a literary marker of people and ideas that were nodes of cultural transformation. And because right now we need leaders who can rouse us to such sweeping change if our children and grandchildren are to receive from us a world in which it's safe for them to live. Semitic rhetoric can help us confront these ugly realities. And as you Game of Thrones fans know, winter is coming. There was a crisis in the Agora. The chair of peripatetic philosophy, endowed by the emperor himself, had become vacant. And after thoroughly examining the doctrinal qualifications of the two finalists for the position, chaps named Diocles and Bagoas, the judges could not make up their minds. Some might imagine that two philosophers from the same sect could come to a reasonable agreement on their own, or that they would altogether forego unseemly scrapping for a job. But no. In this case, the candidates soon turned to character assassination, each giving a speech slandering the other. Bagoas' arguments were predictable, but Diocles made an allegation that really ruffled some feathers. Bagoas, rumor has it, is a eunuch. And such a person ought to be disqualified not only from this job, but, quote, he should be banned from the temples, kept from touching lustral basins, and barred from all public spaces. Eunuchs are, after all, bad luck and bad omens, because they're neither man nor woman, but mixed, a hybrid, a monstrosity, and altogether outside the bounds of human nature. This story comes to us from the arch wit of Lucian of Samosata, who worked in the 2nd century CE, and scholars have long suspected that this piece, simply called The Eunuch, was a send-up of Favorinus of Arles, an older contemporary of Lucian, a phenomenally popular sophist, and famously, by his own admission, a eunuch. Rather than concluding by telling us who got the job, though, Lucian finishes with a sassy one-liner. I hope that my son, still but a boy, may have not the mind or the tongue to be a philosopher, but rather the balls. This story, however sarcastically, rejects the centrality of intellect and oratory in public discourse in favor of a gendered and somatic foundation. A bit of Isocrates even suggests that gnome, mind or judgment, and glotta, tongue, can be understood as an encapsulation of traditional rhetoric. Whenever you're about to say something, consider it in your mind, since for many people the tongue runs ahead of good sense. Lucian's tale, therefore, offers an apt starting point for my discussion because it highlights the idea that rhetoric has a strong somatic component, and because it shows public discourse hinging on the presence or revelation of a disgusting body. So hold on to the example of Diocles and, more importantly, Bagoas for a moment, and let me bring to the table two more preliminary matters before getting to the three ugly bodies that I will discuss in most detail: Homer's Thersites, Plato's Socrates, and Diogenes of Sinope. Most importantly, I believe that this job, not the chair of peripatetic philosophy in ancient Athens, but this position in classical rhetoric and engaged citizenship in your Athens. It's such an easy hook, thank goodness. Is there a bet that every candidate's going to have that? That this job requires a vision of the rhetorical tradition that transcends the traditional conception of rhetoric as merely oratorical theory and practice. We live in an age of 6-second Vine videos and disappearing Snapchat pictures, which makes it difficult to maintain that truly engaged citizenship hangs on the recognition of the moment when the president shifts from his exordium to his peroratio. To be sure, more traditional approaches to classical rhetoric have their place, and I've outlined this in my syllabuses, which some of you have seen. I'd be happy to distribute more as I get copies if anyone wants to see them. But these more traditional approaches must be conditioned by the recognition that in antiquity, oratorical mastery, according to traditional guidelines, was a primary avenue to social advancement, as it no longer is in our world today. Like many other art forms, ballet and painting, for example, oratory was prized for being a matter of form. The ability to work effectively and creatively within traditional forms demonstrated your education, intelligence, skill, and ultimately social worth. But once someone breaks away from traditional formal constraints, as Picasso did with painting and Martha Graham did with dance, it becomes hard to imagine a world again structured around formal limitations. Thus, what we need today to address the goals and aspirations of this job is a notion of rhetoric that builds upon the Aristotelian foundation in ways that speak to our modern condition on the cusp of the Anthropocene. A vision of rhetoric that continues to aim at resisting domination and promoting justice through our symbolic intervention in the history that we inhabit. Traditional approaches to classical rhetoric, which intervenes in history primarily through oratorical argumentation, are no longer sufficient. And so I will pursue one version of my approach to rhetoric by examining the manner in which depictions of ugly bodies have traditionally shaped rhetorical dynamics. While my vision of the intersection of rhetoric and engaged citizenship is quite broad, I'll pair it with a narrower issue, which, for the sake of time, I can present only in broad stroke. The ugly rhetorical bodies that I will discuss, starting with Bagoas, are not merely unattractive oddities. Rather, they activate aspects of disgust, an emotion recently the topic of a great deal of study by psychologists and evolutionary biologists. And this summer I'll join a group of classicists who are jumping into the mix at an interdisciplinary conference on disgust and classics at the University of Edinburgh. The neural workings of disgust are quite complex, so let me focus on two issues that will help us work through the information I'll present in a moment. That doesn't look like what it was supposed to look like. How about that? There we go. First, what we might call the hardwiring of disgust in our brains evolved as a reflex that helped early humans avoid sickness and disease stemming from contact with matter that could harm us. And this side of disgust exhibits a consistent and stable pattern across cultures. Most importantly, the yuck face, as it's formally called by disgust theorists. So our bodies are trained to spit out meat that has gone bad, and we avoid contact with things like feces and corpses whenever possible. But at some point, and I can't stress the importance of this enough, this autonomic response came to be entangled in a broader psychological system. What's typically called socio-moral disgust is the evolutionary extrapolation from the disgust that we feel about, say, accidentally ingesting rotten food to the feelings that we have at the violation of some normative boundary. This latter category involves an extremely flexible set of triggers that varies from culture to culture and from person to person. Thus, one group may find it disgusting to eat with one hand rather than the other. Another may find homosexual sex disgusting. Another may find it disgusting for menstruating women to prepare food. On and on and on. The list is unending. Such issues can also change quite quickly over time. For example, during my lifetime, American culture has shifted away from viewing working mothers with the contempt that is a harbinger of disgust, while cigarette smoking has become increasingly stigmatized as a revolting habit that ought to be strictly controlled, if not banned altogether. These last instances lead into my second broad point about disgust, namely that socio-moral disgust helps to patrol the boundaries of normativity, powered as it is by the same reflexive response that so immediately makes us expel dangerous matter from our mouths. Anthropologists have shown that social norms enforced by disgust effectively serve to promote tribal cohesion that affirms group solidarity, while also inculcating the sense that anyone who violates the norms is other, dangerous, and disgusting. This is why, to return to my initial anecdote, Diocles suggests that Bagoas, because he lacks testicles, ought to be kept away from lustral basins. Bagoas's body, because it does not live up to the normative model, threatens the purity and hygiene of the community. Diocles' rhetoric is based on the assumption that in his community, the rationally non-threatening absence of testicles would consign Bagoas to the category of filthy, pestilential, and noxious things. Presumably, Bagoas would not have done anything unusual with those lustral basins, but his lack of testicles transforms him in this context into a social pollutant. With these preliminaries in place, a big picture of the rhetorical tradition and a thumbnail sketch of disgust, we're ready to get down to business. And I'll start this section with a question. Why is it that Michel de Montaigne, the Renaissance humanist writing in the second half of the 16th century, was so baffled by the ugliness of Socrates, a figure whom Montaigne admired in nearly every other way? He claims that nature treated Socrates unjustly He quotes a bit of Cicero's Tusculan Disputations to show that aesthetics of body and soul should reflect and reinforce one another. And he describes ugliness as an unseemliness at first sight, which is principally lodged in the face and disgusts us on very slight grounds. Why, if he considered Socrates a paragon of virtue, did Montaigne stumble on this issue of his physical appearance? These comments come from an exceedingly complex essay titled Physiognomy, which, except in the passage that I've just drawn from, has surprisingly little to say about the pseudoscience of physiognomy. What becomes clear is that Montaigne sees the loveliness or ugliness of one's body as the first stage in human communication. Prefiguring the televised debates between Nixon and Kennedy, Montaigne claims that our visual assessment of a person preconditions the relationship that is about to unfold. This issue, I suspect, is the real crux of the passage, and as so often with Renaissance humanists, it's almost certain that Montaigne got his idea from a theme in classical literature that stretches all the way back to Homer. Once upon a time, in the archaic Greek period, a man's high social status was designated regularly with the term agathos, which means good or noble. In Homer, any number of exceptional figures can be designated agathos. For example, in Book 21 of the Iliad, Achilles is all but drowned in the Scamander River outside of the walls of Troy, and he wails to the gods, "If only Hector had killed me, since he's the most agathos man around here." Then an agathos man would have made the kill, and an agathos man would he have killed. Such neat aristocratic economy typifies the Homeric world, but we can see the opposite of the agathos man in a few places. Most pointedly, in the relationship between somatic and verbal rhetoric in an earlier scene involving a guy named Thersites. To recap the basic Iliadic narrative, Book 1 begins with a confrontation between Achilles, the great warrior, and Agamemnon, the top king, over Briseis, a female war captive whom Agamemnon commandeers, even though she had originally been allotted to Achilles. Achilles denounces Agamemnon savagely, but allows Briseis to be led away, and then decides to withdraw altogether, a stance Achilles will maintain until the death of his boon companion Patroclus. In Book 2, we get a replay of this confrontation in a different social register through the figure of Thersites. Although other poetic traditions remembered him as an elite player, the Iliad presents Thersites as something of a common soldier and a rabble-rouser who antagonizes the top military brass. But before we hear Thersites speak, Homer gives him one of his richest descriptions of a human body. He was the ugliest man that came to Troy. Bow-legged and lame in one foot, his hunched shoulders loomed over his chest, and above them his head was pointy, with only a few sparse tufts of hair. Homer works hard here to make sure that we see Thersites as the somatic opposite of the likes of Achilles and Hector. From toe to head, his body represents a failure of nature in ways that return us to the example of the eunuch Bagoas. Thersites is not merely unattractive. In a world in which many figures can boast having divinities in their family trees, Thersites represents the body as meat, with hardly a spark of divine grace to animate his limbs. Homer, it would seem, has created Thersites to be a figure whom we're preconditioned to loathe. When Thersites gets the chance to open his mouth, he rails against Agamemnon in a manner that reiterates much of what Achilles had said earlier. But inasmuch as Thersites falls short of Achilles' somatic beauty, so too does he lack the hero's moral authority. In terms of the verbal rhetoric, there's an interesting mix of issues here. On the one hand, Thersites quotes two lines of Achilles exactly as he had said it. We can write this off as little more than the verbal strategies of an oral bard, who frequently repeats stock epithets, lines, and even full scenes, yet we do so at our peril. As Gerard Genet has shown, such repetitions while they may indeed be the result of oral compositional strategies, also create a system of internal parodies and resonances. Thus, in these two lines, Thersites speaks Achilles' words again. He repeats, he reiterates, and recoups Achilles' sentiments, but articulated from a different personal perspective. On the other hand, the rest of Thersites' speech stands out for being so ungainly. In just 3 lines, Homer describes Thersites' voice as being immoderate, ineffective, and he's a disorderly speaker of disorderly words. Furthermore, as Richard Martin, with whom I studied Homer at Stanford, notes, Thersites' speech has a strikingly high rate of epic corruption, a metrical effect typically avoided by Homer that gives a sense that Thersites is slurring his words. Or perhaps they limp and stumble in a way that mimics the movements of his bent and ugly body. Whatever the case, Thersites' body emblematizes his social role, which is confirmed by his wobbly metrics. And in this scene, Odysseus responds to Thersites' body and words by giving him a vicious thrashing that leaves the wretch battered and sobbing. Thersites' visage and delivery are the perfect poetic markers of his low social status. So far as I know, there are no images from antiquity of Odysseus beating up Thersites, so I had to get Achilles beating up Thersites. Everybody beats up Thersites. Within the Iliadic world, his appearance preconditions and justifies the physical violence and mockery he endures. Ugliness here serves as a social marker that normalizes Odysseus' oppressive behavior. Thersites' physical, verbal ugliness, unless checked, threatens to infect the rest of the Achaean, or Greek army, with a desire to contend with kings, just like the disgusting eunuch Bagoas threatens to infect the community via the lustral basins that he might touch. Aristocratic privileges, such as better nutrition and freedom from back-breaking labor, surely created real somatic distinctions between elites and commoners. And this passage provides a rhetorical justification for understanding physical appearance as a normative indicator of status. Thersites proves that in this context, ugliness is tantamount to being the opposite of agathos. Toward the end of the Archaic period, 6th century BC, Greek culture experienced a radical transformation, the likes of which we rarely, if ever, find in the later historical record. The rise of the hoplite phalanx, the emergence of coinage, broadening political franchise, and the rudiments of natural philosophy convulsed 6th century Greek communities. Theognis, a 6th century poet from Megara, speaks to this shift with aristocratic contempt. In describing the unrest that arose in response to unprecedented social mobility, he says of the Hicks who only yesterday wore goat skins and inhabited the woods like deer, now these are the agathoi, and those who were once noble are now condemned. Theognis here reacts to the social upheaval that forced blue-blooded aristocrats to rub grubby elbows with people beneath them in social status, but suddenly rivals in terms of political influence. He likens the newly powerful faction to animals and thereby presents their political ascendancy as a transgression of the bestial sub-elites onto the turf of godlike aristocrats. As Walter Donlan has shown, it was in this era that the use of agathos to designate aristocrats came to be insufficient. In response to circumstances such as that referenced by Theognis, in which it became hard to know who exactly was agathos, aristocrats began to self-identify also in terms of being kalos, beautiful. Eventually, this new concept became codified into the word kalokagathia, which is a really wonderful contraction, a contraction of beauty and goodness. Beauty was implicitly involved in social status prior to the classical era, but now it was explicitly part of the language of privilege. I suggest that the notion of kalokagathia has remained a pillar of the Western aesthetic system ever since, and that this aesthetic framework has preconditioned the shape and function of the rhetorical tradition. In Herodotus' ethnography of Egypt, for example, he presents bodies behaving in ways that were unnatural to his Greek audience. He tells us, for example, that Egyptian men urinate sitting down, whereas Egyptian women pee standing up. Or again, he says that they knead their dough with their feet rather than their hands. If we agree that ancient depictions of bodies served as proxies for our interpretation of character, then somatic inversions like feet instead of hands, sitting instead of standing, male instead of female, serve to construct Egyptians as the epitome of the barbarian other by describing them rhetorically as precisely inverting Greek behavioral norms relating to the body. This idea explodes into the history of social oppression and segregation based on body types, as scientific, moral, political, and religious discourses reinforce our biological reaction to what we perceive as disgusting. Female bodies, African bodies, Jewish bodies, homosexual bodies, disabled bodies, old bodies have all at one time or another been categorized according to the principle of Thersites. What we decree to be somatically inferior, unappealing, and ugly is placed across the normative boundary of social privilege. It is constructed from within and without as rhetorically powerless, and thus it is. Yet, if Thersites gives us a baseline model for how the Western tradition has dealt with bodies, we can now turn to some of the interesting exceptions to this rule, with Plato's description of Socrates in his dialogue called the Symposium being the most famous case. We pick up at the tail end of a restrained and civilized drinking party that's about to go on a bender. Socrates has just described how one can gaze upon the form of beauty in what is often known as the ascent passage. The trick is to start by finding a beautiful body to love. Pretty easy. Then realize that you can find that same beauty in various bodies. Again, not too hard. From here, you need to make the more difficult leap of understanding that the rush of excitement you get when conversing with all these beautiful bodies shows that you're really interested in the beauty of their minds, a step which carries us away from bodies altogether. From here, you generalize further until you can see pure body. Oh, excuse me. Oh, that was a bad misnomer. Pure beauty. There we go. You can see pure beauty in its perfectly disembodied, purely intellectualized guise. But next in Plato's dialogue, the handsome young Alcibiades bursts into the party, already rather drunk, and proceeds to launch into a eulogy of Socrates before convincing everyone to cut loose and get hammered. What is interesting here is that Plato, after all that talk about beauty, has Alcibiades start by describing Socrates' ugly body. He's like Silenus, that ugly, horny old drunk from mythology who usually trails behind Dionysus and whose physiology leaves him somewhere between man and beast. Yet once you get to know him, Alcibiades argues, you will recognize that Socrates' inner person is like a divine image of the gods. Thus, Socrates is, rather like our eunuch Bagoas, a hybrid and a monster. His exterior is part man, part beast. His interior is part man, part god. And the combination is ambiguous and indeterminate. But whereas Bagoas' eunuchism is a dirty little secret, usually hidden from view by his clothing, Socrates' face is the thing by which he's most immediately and easily recognized. Bagoas, Diocles claims, is flawed on the outside and therefore also flawed on the inside. But Socrates is flawed on the outside and nevertheless good on the inside. The logic of kalokagathia, beautiful gentlemanliness, no longer applies in Plato, since for all his anti-democratic politics, Plato constructs an epistemology that is anti-aristocratic in its championing of logos, rational capacity, over mythos, which I'll define for the moment as charismatic authority. Plato, therefore, gives us in Socrates a hero whose verbal rhetoric is as anomalous as his face. Like the ugly satyr Marsyas, who charmed people with his flute playing, Alcibiades tells us, Socrates charms people with his words. For readers of Plato's Gorgias, and I'm aware, by the way, that it's something of an anomaly for a candidate for a rhetoric job to talk more about Plato's Symposium than Plato's Gorgias, but for readers of Plato's Gorgias, which attacks sophistic rhetoric on the grounds that it charms without offering any substance, Alcibiades' description of Socrates' effect on people may seem like a Platonic hypocrisy. How can we resolve this apparent contradiction? My answer, not surprisingly, emerges from the importance of ugliness. Our modern sensibilities, I suspect, can too easily cause us to overlook the symbolic importance of Socrates' ugliness. Montaigne, as I've already shown, wrestled with this problem, and so too did Nietzsche, who, in his Twilight of the Idols from 1889, sees the rise of Greek philosophy as a sign of cultural decline. This is a horrible slide, sorry it's so packed, but it's important stuff. Very early in his discussion, he says this about Socrates. By birth, Socrates belonged to the lowest class. Socrates was plebeian. We are told and can see in sculptures of him how ugly he was. And there are lots of sculptures of Socrates. But ugliness in itself is an objection. It is among the Greeks almost a refutation. Was Socrates a Greek at all? Ugliness is often enough the expression of a development that has been crossed, thwarted in some way, or it appears as declining development. The anthropological criminologists tell us that the typical criminal is ugly. Monstrum in fronte, monstrum in animo. Monstrous in your appearance, monstrous in your soul. But the criminal is a decadent. Was Socrates a typical criminal? At least that would be consistent with the famous judgment of the physiognomist that so offended the friends of Socrates. This foreigner told Socrates to his face that he was a monstrum, that he harbored in himself all the worst vices and appetites, and Socrates merely answered, "You know me, sir." End of quote of Nietzsche. This passage comes from the end of Nietzsche's career and represents his most mature, which also in his case means most insane, confrontation with the problem of Socrates, which begins with the problem of the philosopher's body. But even in his first major work, The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche speaks of Socrates destroying tragedy, because with his, quote, one great cyclops eye, end quote, he could not see, appreciate, or tolerate the abysmal depths of tragedy. For Nietzsche, Socrates is monstrous because, like a cyclops, his physiology impedes him from seeing in 3 dimensions, with the result that Socrates fails to understand one of Athens' greatest forms of art. Alexander Nehamas has argued that Montaigne and Nietzsche obsessed primarily over the problem of Socratic irony. But my research suggests that for Montaigne and Nietzsche, as well as, I believe, Plato's ancient audience, the problem of Socrates' ugliness preceded and shaped the issue of Socratic irony. And whereas Thersites was made by Homer to deserve his beating, Plato shaped Socrates for a different purpose. Plato emphasizes Socrates' appearance as a way to shake us out of our normative torpor in order to facilitate our understanding of the forms. Socrates was devoted to beauty, but his face destabilizes our confidence in the limits of the human body as a guide to the real. The theory of forms generally, and the Ascent passage specifically, states that, while connected in some way, the beauty of the body cannot and so must not be the same as the beauty of the good. Thersites comes to us poorly made, but in Socrates we see animal, man, and God in awkward juxtaposition. As an overture in a rhetorical moment, Socrates' face puts us off balance. His ugly body prepares us for the transcendence of Platonic metaphysics, while also making the embodied claim that we need to listen without aesthetic bias, that the social elite have no exclusive claim to good ideas. Socrates' body may help us to make the cognitive leap needed to get to the Platonic forms, but metaphysics has little use for rhetoric or bodies except in the broadest possible sense. Montaigne and Nietzsche absorbed this lesson of Plato's literary construction of Socrates and applied it to their own quests to develop and articulate their literary personas. How one becomes what one is, as Nietzsche put it in the subtitle to Ecce Homo. Their fascination with Socratic ugliness allowed Montaigne and Nietzsche to step outside themselves and unleash their rhetorical selves, which, in turn, became instruments of intellectual critique. But for all the advantages of this path of understanding Socratic ugliness, one can also sense that the move into the metaphysical realm could be seen as a cop-out in terms of terrestrial realities. And for this reason, I want to move from Thersites as the ugly body that deserves to be oppressed, and Socrates as the ugly body that allows us to transcend this world, to a final example of ancient ugliness, namely the Cynics, or the dog philosophers. The Cynics were followers of Socratic ugliness, who turned philosophy towards social critique via new bodily extremes. The Cynics redirected the rhetorical goad that was Socrates' ugly face toward a performance that called for social change. Legend has it that Plato, in response to the antics of Diogenes of Sinope, the quintessential Cynic, called him a Socrates gone mad. Before going any further, it will be helpful to have a quick sketch of cynicism with a capital C, since it differs starkly from modern notions of being cynical with a lowercase c. Cynicism was a brand, never a formal school of philosophy, that emphasized the embodied art of living. It began with Antisthenes, a follower of Socrates, and the Greek word cynic, which means dog-like, may have originated in the fact that Antisthenes taught at Kunosarges, the place of the white dog. But cynicism really gained prominence through the figure of Diogenes, an obstreperous rascal who embraced the social role of the dog in his art of living as a form of political and social protest. He masturbated and shat in public. He embraced poverty and lived in a tub. He insulted the likes of Plato and Alexander the Great and anyone else he could get to listen. Cynicism was also more welcoming to women than other philosophical outlooks. Hipparchia of Maronea, for example, married a fellow Cynic, Crates of Thebes, in a union that the latter termed, I love this word, kunogamy, dog marriage. And Apuleius tells rollicking stories of the two publicly enjoying conjugal moments throughout the Athenian agora. But in the annals of cynicism, the comeliness of one's physical body, or lack thereof, is not of central concern, as was Socratic ugliness. Rather, the emphasis is on stories about Diogenes and his ilk performing ugliness or shamelessness. By forcing others to notice his public performance of typically private behaviors such as defecation and masturbation, Diogenes challenges audiences to examine normative boundaries. Is it truly disgusting to see him poop? Or is it an artificial cultural barrier that makes it offensive? This ultimately is the question that drives cynicism, and the articulation of that question emerges from the Cynic's bodily training and discipline. In the passage, the long passage I read a moment ago from Nietzsche's Meditation on Socrates, we hear that Socrates began life in physiognomic harmony. He was physically ugly and correspondingly vicious and libidinous. But he devoted his life to changing his inner person in such a way that we all must carefully consider the discrepancy between body and soul. The Cynics effectively took the opposite path. Whatever body you were born with, beautiful or ugly, needs to be trained into submission. Because the very notion of a beautiful or an ugly body is not natural and only derives from an aesthetic judgment based exclusively on social, even tribal norms. If you believe that you're ugly or beautiful, you have already drunk the cultural Kool-Aid, and your only chance for escaping that matrix is to train your body to be in line with your nature, or at least to meditate on that lifestyle undertaken by the cynics. So whereas Socrates submits his soul to rigorous ascetic training, the cynics begin with their bodies. In some ways, they can be thought of as the originators of critical rhetoric in their attitude toward domination and freedom. And as my dear friend Louisa Shea put it in her book, The Cynic Enlightenment, living differently becomes the basis for thinking differently. The cynic approach to the world can be traced in fascinating directions in the ancient world. From Aesop, perhaps the ugliest and most obstreperous character from all of antiquity, to Jesus, as depicted in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, to the Emperor Julian, whose cynic leaning brought him into conflict with many of his subjects, to the late antique figure of the Christian ascetic holy man, who, particularly in the deserts of Syria, performed a type of bodily ascesis or training that left them, by any normative standard, disfigured and disgusting, yet whose hagiographers described them as beautiful and sweet-smelling. Simeon the Stylite, for example, spent much of his career standing on a pillar, mortifying his flesh. One day, a great king came to pray in his presence, and a maggot fell from one of Simeon's festering wounds. The king promptly picked it up and declared it to be a holy relic. Socrates' metaphysical ugliness replayed through Christian rhetoric as a different sort of symbolic intervention in history, as a paradoxical, beautifully sacred ugliness. But rather than pursuing these fascinating paths that open up once you start noticing the importance of ugliness as a rhetorical marker in ancient texts, I'd like to turn to Michel Foucault. Several of Foucault's major works, particularly those dealing with the medical establishment and penal system, generated the common perception that he largely denied the possibility of social resistance, because all strategies for resistance were ultimately mirages, systems of control that reinscribed resistance into structures of domination. Yet the last series of lectures he gave at the Collège de France on the themes of Socrates and cynicism show a markedly different approach. He begins with Socrates and emphasizes how he transferred the concept of parrhesia, truth-speaking, which risks both offending the listener and endangering the speaker, from the narrowly political realm into the world of ethics. But he ultimately finds Socrates' approach to be too genial, too beneficent. Whereas Socrates practices an art of living that aims at self-improvement through conversation at the intersection of language and knowledge, Foucault sees the cynics living and performing the physical embodiment of truth, rather than the more traditional parrhesiastic practice of speaking truth. Combining the perspectives of cynicism and Foucault, a critical rhetorical practice emerges from their shared emphasis on the body and the rigorous training of the body as an overture in the evaluation of existing relationships of power. Power for Foucault is neither unidirectional nor the antonym of resistance. Rather, power is diffused through a network of relationships that most often focus on bodies. It is thus through the control of our bodies and our performance of that control that we can articulate our freedom from domination. As Shea puts it, truth literally takes shape in the cynic's body. It does not exist as an abstract category, but only as a lived praxis. And in the cynic's disregard for normative behavior, and in the performance of what, from a normative perspective, seems ugly and disgusting, we can envision what Dr. Biesecker calls turning the grid of intelligibility that organizes the present, so that we can incite each other to action and toward new forms of communal existence. But this all starts, as I think these ancient examples have shown, in the recognition that the prefigured disgust we feel towards bodies is in fact the rhetorical structure, the symbolic intervention in history upon which all subsequent communication and social relations are built. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, an older contemporary of Foucault, argued that ethics is predicated on a moment of communication, the moment when we see a subjective self in the face of another. Our obligation to that other person stems from the moment of recognition and challenges us to accept the idea that kindness without the expectation of reward is valuable. Levinas' consistent emphasis on the face and how we look at one another makes him a fitting thinker with whom to conclude my talk. I've suggested that ugliness in antiquity serves as a rhetorical overture. So too, to be sure, does beauty. But beauty draws us in and too easily dupes us into an ethical feeling. Keats can say that beauty is truth, beauty. But too often beauty turns out to be precisely and specifically the facade of truth. This is one pillar of Plato's critique of sophistry. It bedazzles us without offering anything more substantive than surface effects. Ugliness and disgust, by contrast, repel us. They work on several levels. Biologically, disgust helps keep us safe from pathogens. Socially, ugliness and disgust can participate in the normative boundaries that facilitate community formation. And rhetorically, a discourse about disgusting, ugly bodies can serve to make us particularly aware of those boundaries. As when Diocles reveals, with an oratorical flourish, that Bagoas has no balls, a somatic factoid that makes the audience draw back in horror at the possibility that they might be forced to share public space with such a debased and potentially polluting sack of flesh. I focused primarily on three ugly bodies. First, Thersites, whom I compared to a hunk of meat. But we can always choose to read differently. With Levinas, we can look not so much at Thersites' body as a sign of his difference from the Homeric heroes, but rather at his eyes that well with tears of pain and shame as Odysseus thrashes him and the army howls with laughter. When we do so, we can see in Thersites a subjective self and ennoble him by acknowledging his humanity. Our second ugly body was Socrates, whose ugliness Alcibiades uses to jumpstart his eulogy. Yet as we, with Alcibiades and a host of others, recognize the discrepancy between Socrates' body and inner person, we can come to a new and more progressive vision of the personhood we impute to the other. Thersites may elicit our pity, but Socrates has no interest in our apologetic reaction to his body. Instead, the Platonic Socrates challenges us to transcend our bodily fascination in an upward trajectory that leads to the forms. Montaigne and Nietzsche, and to be sure many others, used the impetus of Socratic ugliness as a first step in developing their own sense of self and their own individual voices. And finally, with the Cynics and Foucault, and Foucault's call for a renewal of cynicism as a bodily performance of living, we reach the point at which normative perceptions of ugly and disgusting behavior affect a call to reconsider normativity altogether. Where does this leave us moving forward? And what does this mean in real terms? Do the strategies of working with ugly bodies that I have set out here continue to offer meaningful ways to engage our communities? I believe that in deeply modified form, the answer is yes, and I'll conclude by showing how this might work. When we look at the portfolio of new hires here at UGA that comprise the President's Interdisciplinary Hiring Initiative, we see that these positions work together to promote the skills, technologies, and knowledge bases that will lead to We see that these positions work together to promote the skills, technologies, and knowledge bases that will lead to competency as global citizens in the coming era that will be dominated by issues of global interconnectedness, cyber technologies, our post-genomic conception of the human animal, and rapid, probably catastrophic climate change. These are the critical parameters of the Anthropocene, the new term for our current geological era in which human activities are coming to shape the climate and ecology of our planet. In a more Hollywood dialect, we might say that most of these new positions aim to help us ward off or survive the impending zombie apocalypse. That flexible narrative mode that so often now expresses our anxieties about worst-case scenarios stemming from pandemic disease, resource scarcity, genetic modifications, or the breakdown of benevolent governmental control. As this crisis looms, one of the things that average citizens can do is to recognize the importance of the rhetoric of bodies. Technology is moving us closer to harmonizing human bodies and machines. Evolutionary biology is revealing how fuzzy the lines are that separate human and non-human animals. The ever-increasing wealth gap is creating new modes of financially based segregation and domination. And the growth of the human population makes it ever more difficult to empathize with the bodies and body counts that we face in our news streams. Yet one of the cornerstones of Aristotelian rhetorical theory is the need to establish human connections. Ethos, pathos, and logos are Aristotle's terms for this. Kenneth Burke calls it identification. Levinas describes it in terms of looking into the face of another. The official posting for this job calls it engaged citizenship. While we need not pursue bodily ugliness ourselves, our bodies continue to offer the best means for each of us to perform our values, to critically reflect upon those values, and to recognize in others the subjectivity upon which we can build ethically and not only rhetorical relationships. Thanks. Yes?
I was wondering if you could speak to Foucault's distinction between political parousia and ethical parousia, because you sort of end with this need to sort of engage in a kind of frank speech that takes problems as they are, kind of thinks of what works as a good, effective rhetorical strategy. And my reading of his reading of the Cynics and ethical parousia is a kind of reduction to bare life. I don't see him being terribly interested in whether they pooped or masturbated in public and violated acceptable norms, but a kind of militant bare life that then opens up the possibility for some other life or truth. And that's the distinction with Socrates, because it wasn't about comporting your body with your soul or your soul with your speech, but militant life that then opens up, we don't know what, right?
Absolutely.
It's a transformation of the self by way of that reduction to bare life.
And you're absolutely right in terms of the word militant, that this is what makes the Cynics in antiquity attractive. And so the issues of things like pooping in public are a militant expression of the rejection of social norms. And of course, Foucault has no interest in that sort of specific pointer. That really stands out, I think, as a literary marker of what the Cynics were up to. For Foucault, he sees cynicism really in terms of something, the modern revival of cynicism is something that should be undertaken by a very militant few, and that this is the hard core that will lead to broader social transformation. I've backed off from that in my own reading, in part because I frankly get kind of scared with some of the militant extremes that Foucault goes to. So what I'd like to see in terms of my own balance with this is something in which ethical parousia can be applied in smaller ways, in which we are resisting social pressures to conform, without necessarily expecting everyone to go to such extremes. I do think that there is a value in having people go further than small gestures in your everyday life, to be sure. But one of the tricks, one of the issues, one of the conundrums about cynicism, I think, is that in focusing so much on somatic training, it doesn't necessarily lead to, as I quoted from Shea, and as Foucault writes himself, it doesn't lead directly to truth. What it leads to is challenging. And that challenge could go awry. Your cynic, militant training could lead you in a direction that ultimately we look back on and say, whoops, that one didn't work out so well. So I think that there is, there's both a need to pull back from Foucault a bit, but also to recognize that what he's calling for is not necessarily a path to success, but a path to shaking things up. And part of the reason that I came down in this way on the talk was that I recently had the chance to meet Jeffrey Sachs, who's always been one of my heroes in terms of economics. And in talking with him after his presentation, I said, the typical question that I'm sure most people ask him, what can those of us who are in this room do? And he basically said nothing. It's too late. If you don't run a major corporation, if you don't have the ear of a major governmental leader, if you don't have Richard Branson's wealth, there's really nothing you can do, so don't worry about it. And I thought, I think we can do better than that. And part of what he is after is the idea that there is a cliff that we will fall off into complete perdition that he's hoping we can avoid. I think that what is more likely is that we need to evolve new ways of working in the world, and that we need to be prepared for change in a way that something like Foucault's call for resuscitating cynicism will help us to accomplish. Because I do think that we in this room can do things. I think it's hard to understand why we need to keep breathing if we don't have a sense that we can keep fighting the good fight, however we see that in our own terms. I'm not sure that really adequately addressed your issue, but sort of talked around it. Is that okay? Yes.
I have a question. I kind of want to play the part of a sophist for a second and defend the neomus.
It's the second
claim.
time today.
Second, right?
You're into this, okay?
Yeah. So you mentioned before that the neomus interpretation of Nietzsche is that it's less of an emphasis on the body than it is on irony. But like going back to Platonic irony, I mean, I'm wondering what justifies the primacy of the embodied over the figural, because it seems as though with the Thersites example that you provided, that there's this mimesis, like a figural mimesis between the outward appearance and the inward character, and Socrates represents more of an inversion, like a paradox of appearance and substance, right? And I mean, thinking back to Gorgias even, right? Like the figure of paradox seems to be also something that is generative and subversive in that context, insofar as Helen is being used as a vehicle that is not only inverted from the traditional role, but also being used to demonstrate the figural power of rhetoric. So in those cases, right, the shift from mimesis to paradox seems to be as powerful of a player as the embodied and kind of transcendental experience of disgust. So I'm wondering, why not instead the figural over an embodied description?
That's a very smart question. And first off, in terms of Helen, I think that Helen worked very much in the same way here. And in the research that I'm currently engaged in, one of the things that has become clear is that issues of bodily disgust in the ancient world are deeply gendered, and what's gross about a male body is different from what's gross about a female body. And Helen deserves a whole chapter herself, because it's in her bodily perfection that one starts to feel unease, even revulsion at the ethical substance of who she is, which leads to that paradoxical flip. But in terms of the more direct issue that you're getting at, I think that the shift to the figural is actually predicated on the power of your reaction to the body. So I would see that this actually is a move to the figural. I like that, and I think that that's just fine. But that move can happen because Socrates' appearance, when you first confront it, causes you to jump back a bit. And it's so striking that it causes that flipping into the figural realm. So what I'm really interested in here is not so much the history of real human ugly bodies. That's a whole different topic. What I'm interested in is the way in which the depiction of ugliness leads into changed rhetorical dynamics. And so I think that you're absolutely right that this is what leads into the figural, is the shock of seeing his face. Sure. Yes.
Are we out of time? Can I ask another question?
Yeah, we're fine, go.
Okay, good. No, well, this might seem to come out of left field, but I have a question about metaphor. I enjoyed your talk very much.
Thank you.
And I enjoyed how you kind of traversed history and went through these various epochs. And you know, it struck me that the language of ugliness, revulsion, disgust changes over time. You know, the actual language changes, but the terms change as well. And you know, when we're using a word like disgust, you know, it has etymological and metaphorical underpinnings, right, which are about consuming other people, and the gustatory experience of encountering something else, or you know, that inducing nausea and wanting to, you know, disgust turning into disgorge, disgorging. What's the word I'm looking for? Disgorging something.
In a rhetorical context,
Vomit. I just learned the other day that actually it's only carnivores that vomit, and things that don't eat meat do not vomit. Like a horse. If a horse eats something poisonous, it will just die. It won't vomit. But you know, I think we're almost trained to encounter others through, you know, the metaphor of meat and whether the meat is good or not. In some ways, but you know, as we sort of move from one language of disgust or revulsion to the word monstrous, of course, Foucault does a very good job of showing how that relates to a practice of demonstrating what is, you know, inside society and what ought to be outside of society. I'm wondering if you can maybe talk about the metaphors that you encountered. I was trying to pick out the Greek word. I'm not fluent in reading Greek, but in the Thersites piece here, there is the word ugliness somewhere. I just can't pick it out. And I'm wondering what the sort of dominant Greek word for ugliness was, and as you've encountered it, and what metaphor that was attached to, and how those have changed over time. Maybe it might be an ambitious question.
That is an ambitious question, and I'm better able to answer the issue around disgust than ugliness. And in antiquity, and the word here for ugly, where's Thersites? There it is. It's ischistos. It's that first word, which is a superlative, and that word covers physical ugliness, ethical baseness, a range of things along those lines. Also because in antiquity, in classical antiquity, frequently ugliness was described in terms of the negation of beauty. So you can have the word like kalos, beauty, just denied. So there's a whole, there's a range of issues there, and the Greek language of ugly is something that I haven't quite gotten my head around yet. Shame is easier to get at. The word for Bagoas' missing balls is his eidoion, which is his shame, literally. And so human genitals are the shameful bits, and the word comes from the same sort of shame and modesty that we would feel in many situations today, how we would use that word shame, but it gets focalized into the genitals in very standardized language. So that's one interesting twist. But I think the most interesting way to approach your question is through disgust, because the English word disgust comes from the French dégoût, which has this oral incorporation aspect to it. In ancient Greek, the issue is, the word is douskareia, which literally means something that's bad to put your hand to, which is a whole different thing, right? It's not about a gross taste, it's about don't touch that. And one of the things that I didn't have time to get into in terms of the theories of disgust is that basically there are two lines of them that evolutionarily come together in humans. One is the taste issue. Somebody jams a piece of food in your mouth and you find out that it's rotten and you bleh, spit it out. The other is more of a proximity issue. This is what you see, what happens when you see poop in the park or a corpse or something like this. Hopefully not a corpse in the park. Is that there are things from which you want to stay back. And if you tell me that piece of meat is rotten over there, I don't necessarily need to stay back from it because it's not threatening. But there are other things that become point sources of pollution. And so the Greek is really about staying away from those point sources of pollution. Don't go near that poop, don't go near that corpse. Whereas the French, and then into the English, is about don't get it in your mouth. Now the Latin, the word is fastidium, which gives us fastidious, which suggests a great care for things like neatness and order, maybe even bodily regimen in terms of keeping the norms in line, implicitly then, so you don't get in contact with. So if you're fastidious in the proper ways, if you have fastidium, you will naturally stay away from the rotten meat because you ate the meat before it went rotten. If you're fastidium, you'll stay away from the poop and the corpse because if you're fastidium, you'll know how to steer clear of them. So I think that those three examples, the disgust, the fastidium, and the dyschorea, represent three really different takes on how this metaphorical network of issues works in some senses all coming together, but really emphasizing different aspects of it. So I'd like to do more with ugly words and get you a better answer for that, but right now I think disgust is about the best I can do. Thanks. Yes?
So you're not saying that disgust is like linked to the visual?
Disgust has an interesting series of connections with different senses. And basically, there's a really great and emerging body of applied psychological studies of disgust to figure out how people react to things in different ways. And basically, your mouth and your nose are the real core places. So if you see a corpse, you certainly might feel disgust at it because of that. But nothing like you would feel if somebody said, here, take a bite of this corpse, sure, and got it right up in your face. So the eyes keep you, they're an attenuated form of disgust. The nose and the mouth are hypersensitive to disgust. There used to be a big debate about whether or not sounds could be disgusting. But this was in the pre-Hollywood age, before sound effects have been ratcheted up in such a way that I think most of us could. I certainly can feel disgust at certain movies. But before Hollywood, there was this idea that could we find a chord progression? Could we find a dissonance? Could we find an animal noise that would elicit disgust? And the general answer was doesn't seem to be out there. So whether or not you can feel disgust with your ears isn't the point, but it's the most distant. With touch, of course, also being very, I guess you go ears and then eyes and then hands and then mouth and nose are the most important ways of feeling disgust. So absolutely you can feel it visually, but less so than what you taste and smell.
Thank you. I really should have narrowed down my question. That's a great answer. What I meant was,
sorry.
Was it visual in the Iliad? That is, like, if it's like, is it ugliness on one side and then Aristos on the other, right? So Thersites is disgusting because he's so ugly, is the idea, right? But my question is then, why isn't Hephaestus the worst of the gods?
Oh, what a great question. Yes.
And Ares is the worst of the gods, and he's theoretically, right, corrupt to look upon. And then Paris also, right? Mm-hmm. Is probably much worse character than Thersites, and he's much better looking.
Right.
So how do you balance that?
That's a great question, and let me answer it in two ways. One is that even within the rhetoric of Kallikagathia, it was certainly recognized that some people, as devastatingly hot as they may have been, actually weren't all that great. And so Paris gets this, so does Menelaus. Ares is a little bit different because he's physically beautiful, but we hate him because he's the incarnation of berserk war. And so that is a slightly different issue, in which his body, I think, is really the projection of the idealized young male warrior, but his behavior is the young idealized male warrior gone nuts. And so that's part of why Ares is marginalized. But Ares also fits in with a great Homeric joke, which is that who should be Aphrodite's husband? She's the hottest of the hot, right? Well, she should be married to Ares, but she's married to Hephaestus. And this comes out in the second song of Demodocus in the Odyssey, the point of which is that it's ridiculous for Hephaestus to be Aphrodite's husband. So ridiculous, in fact, that she has to go behind his back and have sex with who? Ares. So that opposition is actually very carefully constructed in Homer. Also, at the end of Book 1 of the Iliad, we get a replaying of the Achilles-Agamemnon debate. I didn't have time to include this here, but what happens, Book 2 has Thersites, Book 1 starts with Achilles and Agamemnon, Book 1 ends with Zeus and Hera coming to fisticuffs. So the highest of the gods and the highest of the goddesses are about to get into a domestic dispute. And how is it all resolved? Because hilarious, ugly, gimpy Hephaestus limps around the table pouring wine for everybody, and everybody howls with laughter, and laughter does a wonderful job of diffusing tensions, and we can all move ahead, and everything's fine. So Hephaestus is very much constructed to be an ugly god in Homer. Not always there are other places where he seems to be much more handsome and vigorous, but in Homer, Hephaestus gets the short end of the stick pretty regularly. Sure. Yeah.
So all these philosophers that you talked about, the Cynics and Plato and the late anti-Christians and Foucault, have been challenging in some way, to some degree, the idea that social moral disgust is a good thing. How much have their discussions been driven by having to answer viewpoints that social moral disgust is a good thing? Because my impression has been that at all periods, sort of the dominant opinion has been that social moral disgust is not particularly problematic.
I think social moral disgust has not been particularly problematic in most periods, at least in my reading of history, the periods I focus on, because it works so smoothly. You do that, and you're gross. And that there have always been categories of bodies, categories of behaviors that really put you to the sideline very quickly. There are people who have, in the recent burgeoning of theoretical discussions of disgust, who have said disgust is a really good thing. The British jurist Lord Devlin articulated the really foundational position of this when he said, basically in a ruling on homosexuality, that what we have to agree on is that the average person's sensibilities about issues of disgust need to be taken seriously. If we all kind of sort of agree